production keeps prices down far more effectively.
As long as suffering of sentient beings remain, I will remain in order to serve.
I imagined God like my grandfather.
In conversation tonight, my guest represents perhaps the most powerful economic and military power on earth. While much has troubled the governments of the two nations, there seems to be more that unites the two peoples than divides them. Educated at the universities of Yale and Oxford, he served as an executive assistant to the US ambassador in India, Chester Bowles, in the early 60s, and returned about a year ago to Delhi as his country's ambassador to India. I'm delighted to welcome Richard Celeste.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with you.
Mr. Celeste, in the year that you have been, it's been an unusual, unexpected year for a US ambassador in India, hasn't it?
It has had more than its share of surprises for me. When I first arrived, I hadn't imagined that I would see a national election, and within a few months, I watched that really great manifestation of Indian democracy. I certainly did not expect that I would be dealing with the issues of non-proliferation in quite the way that we have since India's decision to test last May. So it's been a year of unexpected challenges.
So what was India like 30 years later when you returned? You'd been here in the 60s. It was a different time in America, a different time in India's history.
Well, as you know, I wanted to come back to India for this tour. It was at my request that President Clinton chose to appoint me as ambassador. And it's been exciting to find some things which haven't changed and many things which have in the 30 years since I left.
Well, the 60s were also a time of sort of romantic images of India. This was where, Maharishi came and the Beatles came. Were you a part of that were you taken in by the romance of India in the 60s?
I would say I was less here as a child of the 60s than I was as an enthusiast for global politics. I found India, a country that I hadn't really studied a great deal as a student, to be a fascinating textbook, a living textbook, if you will, on post-independence struggles to affirm democracy and to advance economic development.
So what was it that drew you back, an academic interest to look at how democracy and the economy had fared in 35 years?
Well, I've stayed in touch with India over this period of time. I brought trade delegations to India when I was governor of Ohio. I have, I suppose you'd say, an Indian family, a family who are very much a part of my life, and I'm part of their life, and we've stayed in touch over the years. So it was a personal interest. It is a, broadly speaking, political interest. I believe that a great deal about human history has been determined in this part of the world and will be determined in this part of the world if we think 10 or 20 or 30 years down the road. I can't think of a more exciting place to be the U.S. ambassador than here in New Delhi.
I've been privileged to interview a number of your predecessors, and there's always seemed to be an empathy that they felt, an excitement about India, both at a scholarly academic level and at a personal level. And this seems to be the experience of most Indians with Americans and the great interaction and exchange that happens. And yet it's now sort of an oft-repeated cliche that, while the peoples of India and the US seem to get along so well, the relationships between the governments have been frequently troubled. What is your sort of insight on this?
Well, I guess I would go back to my experience when I was a politician. You never had problems with your political adversaries because you didn't have any expectations of them. Your problems were always with your political friends and allies because there were real expectations. And in some respects, I think that the unfulfilled aspect of the relationship between the United States and India has resulted partly because we've had such high expectations of each other. and we're never going to completely fulfill each other's expectations, partly because of our own national imperatives, and I suppose partly because there's always a difference between setting the highest possible goal for ourselves and then performing toward that goal, but falling somewhat short. Meanwhile, at a personal level, as you have pointed out, the bonds between our two countries have grown intensively in the last 35 years. And I would say if you look at, for example, the field of science and technology, the collaborations between scientists in the United States and India are extraordinary over the last 35 years. If you look at trade and economic growth, the United States is far and away India's largest trading partner, its largest foreign investor. And even in difficult times, there is keen interest on the part of many American firms to grow here quite aggressively.
You mentioned sort of even in difficult times. The last year has been one of those difficult times. What has been sort of the difficult time you've had in coping with this?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you would put it that way. I have found it to be a very rewarding time, more than a difficult time. There's frustration in a sense that opportunities that existed virtually at hand, let's say a year ago, certainly up until the tests in May, are now more difficult to realize in the near term. Opportunities, for example, in enhanced military-to-military cooperation. Opportunities for, I think, substantially increased technology exchange, transfer, collaborative research, and so on. Those have been pushed back. But there's been great satisfaction as well in watching and in sharing in the dialogue that's been undertaken by Mr. Jaswant Singh and Strobe Talbot. It is the most senior and sustained dialogue between our two countries, perhaps since India's independence.
Do you think that in some ways the nuclear explosion, and this was one of the justifications that those that supported the explosion in India claimed that India wasn't being taken seriously enough. Would it be fair to suggest that it was because of these explosions that the nature of the serious dialogue that is happening between the two countries might not have happened if there had been no explosion?
I don't know that I would accept the premise here. I believe that we would have had serious dialogue. We had 4 cabinet-level visits in the first 3 months that I was here. This was a manifestation of how seriously we want to engage with India. And the visit of the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Health and Human Services or the Secretary of Commerce were senior level and important indicators of the quality of dialogue that was going to take place. What's happened is that high-level dialogue has now become very focused on a single issue, and that is national security and non-proliferation. It's taken a different twist, if you will, from the kind of dialogue I think we would have enjoyed absent the tests. But we can't change history. I mean, the reality is India made a decision to test. It is the sovereign right of this government or any government to make those decisions and to deal with the consequences, good and bad, that follow. My hope is that through the process of dialogue, that there will come a point in the discussions between the Minister of External Affairs and our Deputy Secretary of State where we can look at our bilateral relations and say, not that we are back to where we were on May 10th, but that we've actually taken a step forward. We have now a much better understanding of each other's views on national security. We have a much better understanding of how we can be supportive of what each needs with respect to this sense of security in a rapidly changing world. That we together will move a non-proliferation agenda forward that will be good for India It will be good for South Asia. It will be good for all of the nations of the world. That's where we need to be, and that's where I hope we can get at the end of this dialogue.
You've mentioned South Asia, and the U.S. positions in the region are fairly well known in Kashmir, and the fact that the U.S. has offered not to sort of be a mediator unless both the countries wanted the U.S. to be. There seems to be almost a sense of hurt in India that India is equated really with Pakistan, and the perception that the U.S. policy has fallen back on the moral principle or the high ground of proliferation, but when it's come to sort of India's other neighbor, China, where the U.S. has had serious concerns on proliferation, on the supply of weapons to other states, human rights, that President Clinton was very comfortable with a visit to China and felt obliged to postpone his visit to India. Perhaps as a community, as a country, there is a more sort of emotional sensitivity in India. How sensitive is the U.S. to the sense of hurt that India feels?
I know that President Clinton is keenly aware of the disappointment that many felt in India when he had to postpone his visit. I don't believe, however, that the government was surprised by that decision. In fact, the first postponement occurred not because of the nuclear tests, but because India was on the verge of national elections, and the president really felt it wouldn't be appropriate to be here while political campaigning was going on. So the formal tying down of dates has been a kind of moving target for him. He very much wants to come to India, and he wants to come to India for the right reasons and in a positive atmosphere. He doesn't want to come to India simply to rake over issues that should be worked out between our two governments prior to any such visit. I think thoughtful Americans understand that it is essential for us to deal with India in its own right. It is unfair to India, and frankly, it's unfair to Pakistan, to try to equate these countries and to try to only see them weighed against each other. In a perverse sort of way, India reinforced the views of those who would like to equate India and Pakistan when it undertook the nuclear tests, because Pakistan then felt compelled to test, and you have two nuclear weapons capable states now, and so there's a tendency to weigh them equally because they now have the capacity to make and deploy nuclear weapons with all of the attendant dangers. So I think there was an unexpected consequence of the tests that enhanced the case for equating India and Pakistan to the frustration, perhaps, of the government of India, and to the frustration of those of us who believe that it is vitally important to recognize and work with India on a whole range of issues where we have a distinct common interest.
India feels sort of selectively penalized when it looks at U.S. policy in China, for example. And I think the defense minister of India was at pains to emphasize that, that there was a threat from the northern border too, in the calculation and in the scheme of things. Well, let me
Can I just take one moment on that? I mean, I was here right after the war with China in 1962, and I'm certainly very, very aware of concerns here about two nuclear-capable neighbors and what that may mean for India's security. We have had a very candid relationship with China, and engagement with China, again, is not engagement in a way that ignores places where we have a different point of view. Indeed, while President Clinton was in China, he spoke out strongly on the human rights issue. He certainly made it a point in his conversations with Chinese leaders to emphasize the importance we attach to restraining sharing any kind of technology for weapons of mass destruction or missiles or delivery systems with whether it's Pakistan or Iran or other countries who might use those in an unfriendly way. I think that, again, I would hope that India doesn't try to calibrate its relationship with the United States as against how we treat China, as against how we treat Pakistan. We should come at it sort of straight on and say, are we doing right by each other? And I believe the honest answer is we haven't done right by each other. We can do better. We should do better. And that's the goal not only of the talks between Strobe Talbot and Jaswant Singh. I think that's the goal that I have every day when I go to work.
To what extent do you think the internal politics of President Clinton's own predicament with the impeachment proceedings, to what degree is that going to affect, I shouldn't say just relations between India and the United States, but the ability of the U.S. government to continue with dialogue and to engage in processes of diplomacy and international engagement? There is a suspicion that that many of the American moves in Iraq have been prompted by political motives. They may or may not have been. That's a question of debate. But to what degree do you think this process has affected the processes of government and diplomacy in the U.S.?
That's a very legitimate concern, and it's a concern that's shared by many in the United States Senate who hope that this matter can be resolved expeditiously, as the President hopes that these questions can be resolved expeditiously. But the point I would stress is that President Clinton, perhaps more than any person I've observed directly or read about in history, has had a capacity to stay focused on his job in spite of whatever has gone on around him. And I think if you look at his investment of time and effort even in the last 6 months, whether we look at Northern Ireland, or we look at the Middle East and the Y Peace Accords, and then his trip to open the airport in Gaza and to be present for the actions by the PLO in changing their own charter in a way that advances the peace process there. One doesn't have, I think it's unfair to the President to simply look at the Iraq situation and say, we judge you by the decisions you made with respect to Iraq. In every case, the President is motivated by bringing peace and stability to a particular region. And I believe he views Iraq and the actions of Saddam Hussein, both with respect to his own citizens and with respect to the UN Inspection Force and the resolutions of the Security Council, to be a persistent threat to peace and stability in that part of what Indians call West Asia, what we think of as the Middle East. I believe the President will stay focused on his job. I believe that he will do his job as conscientiously as he can, and I believe that no national leader is more eager to promote peace, resolve differences, and build a stable global community of nations than Bill Clinton.
There have been, and inevitably there is the baggage of the last year and the Monica Lewinsky case and the scandal and the proceedings. What negative impact do you think it has had on the presidency? And in what ways has it impacted?
The irony is that it may have more of a negative impact on the institution of the presidency than it has had on Bill Clinton's ability to govern. The American people have consistently shown support for this president and the manner in which he has led our nation. And indeed, as we have watched this process of impeachment proceed, one of the bizarre aspects to those of us who sit this far away has been that there seems to be an increasing disconnect between the political process in Washington and what the American people want as represented over and over and over again in public opinion polls. Today, something like 70% of the American people approve the way in which President Clinton is leading our nation and want him to stay in office. That's a remarkable consensus. I think any leader in India would love to have that kind of a consensus behind them. So there is a question as to what happens to the institution of the presidency over the long term. as a consequence of the actions of the special prosecutor.
What does this say about about democracy?
Well, I think it's fair to say that democracy is a tough process to make work. Those of us who've been involved in democratic politics certainly appreciate that. But I think it was Winston Churchill said that democracy is what the most difficult of all forms of government, except maybe the most impossible of all forms of government, except preferable to any other. We make it work. We make it work as best we can, and I respect that process at home. I respect that process here in India.
In what ways has diplomacy changed from the early 60s when you were an executive assistant to the ambassador, and now you serve as an ambassador yourself?
The most profound impact on diplomacy in the last 30 years has been the telecommunications revolution. Obviously, the face of global relations has changed with the end of the Cold War and the kind of new emerging relationships among nations, what's happening in the European community, what's happening in Asia, what's happening here in South Asia with SAARC and so on, changed the landscape. But I think the most stunning difference in the practice of diplomacy is the impact of CNN and the impact of Internet. Somebody sitting at a desk in Washington or at a desk in New Delhi can get the latest statement, can understand what's being said in any House of Parliament or any congressional committee within moments, and certainly any breaking news is conducted under the full exposure of live television. And we saw it reenacted again during the 3 or 4 days of military action in Iraq.
Do you feel that countries frequently, at least in the rhetoric of diplomacy and in foreign policy, tend to fall back on moral positions and things that are morally correct and positions of principle? To what degree do you feel, and without necessarily referring to American policy in particular, to what degree do you feel that to be true? How far is a country's military or economic self-interest in fact a determinant of policy rather than a perceived larger moral right?
I believe that every nation acts in its perceived self-interest, but I believe many nations begin with values that drive that interest. Sometimes, therefore, there's a clash between certain values and other aspects of one's self-interest. There is a clash between, let's say, our commitment to encourage a more peaceful world through non-proliferation regimes on the one hand, and our commercial interests that are frankly harmed by sanctions that we may impose as a result of our convictions about non-proliferation. Similarly, we may choose, because of a concern about fundamental human rights, not to have a relationship with a country where, in other circumstances, there would be economic benefits, market benefits, and communications benefits from being in relationship.
Equally, the other end be true, that you might not sort of go in for sanctions, you might not sort of insist on human rights if there was a dominant commercial interest?
My own view is that in the United States, if there is a fundamental clash between our values and our pocketbook, our values will win out. And I believe that has been demonstrated over and over and over again. And we have been willing to put not only our pocketbook, but the lives of American service people online to protect other countries and other parts of the world where our commercial interest has been minimal. I think most recently, for example, when Taiwan was threatened by the prospect of ballistic missile tests, and we sailed aircraft carriers into that neighborhood at real risk to our people and a real uncertainty as to what the government in Beijing would decide to do. So I think it's not a simple or clear issue. I believe the best relationships and I believe the best foreign policy derive from fundamental values. And it's something I respect about the government of India. It's something I am proud of in terms of my own government, that we take these values seriously. We take the value of democracy seriously.
Ambassador Celeste, thank you very much indeed. That's been a privilege in our meeting.
Thank you.